All right. Good morning, everyone. Before we officially open WAC 2021, we'd like to begin with the land acknowledgement. A land acknowledgement is the first step in acknowledging the important relationship to the land beneath your feet, the history of this land, the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people who called this land home, and the privilege it is to be on this land. An acknowledgement is also a call to action to take both individual and collective responsibility for the past and future of the communities on this land. We wish to acknowledge this land on which Branksome, UCC, and the World Affairs Conference operate. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still home to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work and go to school on this land.
Depending on where you are in the world, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. 1,000 plus curious, ambitious, and enthusiastic high school students, 60 plus schools, and over 15 countries represented spanning from Kenya and India to Australia and New Zealand, where students are joining us at 1 in the morning their time. Truly, something big is happening before our eyes. But before we begin an unprecedented and exciting virtual symposium, we'll start with a quick story. On Tuesday, February 5th, 2020, 364 days ago, the 38th edition of the World Affairs Conference came to a happy conclusion. A group of 40 students managed to take a primitive stride in innovating North America's oldest and largest student-run current affairs conference. There was much to celebrate. But as one leadership team moved on to the next stage of their lives, the next group could never have predicted what was in store for them. Fast forward 12 months of pivots, ebbs and flows, and here we are. On behalf of a team of 60 plus students in Toronto and 40 plus global ambassadors from around the world, welcome to the 39th annual and first ever virtual and global session of the World Affairs Conference. My name is Krishna Bambawale, and I'm joined by Lauren Mahoney, and we are incredibly excited to serve as your co-chairs of this year's conference. As we enter the first session of today's program, we wanted to share what core values have grounded us and our team in pursuit of putting on this event. They are clear: to always be agile and memorable, to dream big, to have fun, listen first, think global, seek discomfort, and always value differences and dissent. We ask that you remember these core values and carry them with you throughout the day and beyond. In light of the most challenging of years, where we have seen inequities become increasingly pronounced and have each been subject to our own series of hardships, we are inspired by the power of humanity in rallying together to positively impact society. There is no doubt in our mind, together we are stronger.
This year's conference theme is Together Towards Tomorrow and addresses principally how we as the next generation can work collectively to make the future brighter in terms of innovation and diversity that will inform the next decade. Today, students will delve into a variety of pressing social and political issues. We encourage you to step outside your comfort zone and challenge your thinking as you engage with an incredible lineup of speakers who are joining us today. WAC will begin with an opening address from a very special speaker who is expert in the important intersection of sustainability and economics. We will then break into plenary sessions at 9:50, where you will have the opportunity to hear from a speaker in your registered plenary. Our 4 plenary topics this year are businesses in COVID, sink or swim, social justice, our history and future, the future of social media, we are the product, and commercial spaceflight, the future of humanity. Following this, our fantastic programs team is hosting the first networking event at 10:20, where you'll be put into breakout rooms and meet participants from around the world. Our second plenary session will be held after this at 10:45. Throughout the lunch period, participants are invited to join the Zoom Startup Exhibition consisting of 14 professional and student startups, where they will be able to hear a short presentation from and ask questions to the founders. At 11:50, the WAC keynote address will be delivered by renowned poet, novelist, playwright, and critic, Dr. George Eliot Clark, who will address global challenges and the histories that set them into being, with an emphasis on diversity, equity, and inclusion. Following this, our programs team is hosting a second networking event at 12:45 before we conclude with our closing panel of speakers who will address the importance of multiculturalism on the stage of innovation. To navigate the conference throughout the day, please access each event using GoToWebinar and Zoom links found in your personal schedule created on our website. If you have yet to create your personal schedule, no worries. Please visit worldaffairs.ucc.on.ca and select your 2 plenary sessions for the day. We will be using Instagram as a communication platform throughout the day to provide updates on events, so please ensure you follow along at World Affairs Con on Instagram. You will have the opportunity to submit text questions to today's presenters by typing your questions into the questions pane of the control panel. You may send in your questions at any time during the presentation. We will collect these and address them during the Q&A session at the end of each presentation. If you have any technology issues throughout the day, please do not hesitate to contact our tech team by emailing worldaffairs.it@gmail.com or sending the organizers a direct message in the chat on a webinar. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here today. Without further ado, I'll hand it back to Krishna to introduce our opening speaker.
Thank you so much, Lauren, and welcome everyone again to the opening panel of the World Affairs Conference. Today, we have the great pleasure of speaking with sustainable finance expert, Andy Chisholm. Andy, if you would join us, please. For those of you listening, this session will run as a 40-minute fireside chat. We encourage you to submit all of your questions, as Lauren mentioned, using the chat function found on the right-hand side of your computer screen, which will then be passed on to me, the interviewer of this session. You will be muted as default for the entirety of this talk. So to introduce our speaker today, for a brief biography on Andy, Andy is a member of the board of directors of the Royal Bank of Canada and RBC Group Holdings. Prior to that, he spent most of his career at Goldman Sachs and Company, which he joined in 1985 in New York. He served in a variety of senior leadership roles during his 30-year career as Senior Strategy Officer of the firm globally, as head of the Global Financial Institutions Group in both London and New York, and as co-chair of the firm-wide Commitments Committee. Andy is a thought leader in the space of sustainable finance, having acted as a member of the Canadian federal government's expert panel on sustainable finance, and subsequently as a member of the Task Force for Resilient Recovery. He sits on the advisory board for the Institute of Sustainable Finance at Queen's University and the Center for Building Sustainable Value at the Ivey Business School, where he is also chair of the Ivey Advisory Board. Amongst various board positions, Andy is also a board member of Evergreen, which focuses on building sustainable cities like we hope Toronto will be, and sits on the investment committee of ArcTurn Ventures, a clean tech venture capital firm. He holds a Bachelor of Commerce from Queen's University and graduated with an MBA from the Ivey Business School at Western University. Andy lives in Toronto with his family, where he is joining us virtually today. Fundamentally, Andy will be addressing the vital role that sustainability must play in global economic development as we embark on creating the most sustainable world possible. So, without further ado, let's get started. Andy, before breaking down this niche and exciting space of sustainable finance, let's go back in time a little bit. Tell us about your perspective on sustainability, how it's changed over the years, and how you got into the field of sustainable finance.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I'm really pleased to be here and be able to talk to everybody. And my story is one similar to others, where there was no master plan. Life just took me for a ride, and it turned out in a particular direction. Starting in your shoes, I went to undergrad. Didn't know what I was going to do after that. I traveled for a year, mostly in Asia. Came back, still didn't know what I wanted to do. Didn't want to pursue the path of my dad or my mom in their careers. There was a family business, but I wasn't keen on going into that. So I went to grad school. As you said, it was an MBA. I was interested in finance, so that was my focus. And at that point, you know, I'm Canadian. I like being outdoors. I valued the environment, but I never thought a lot about it. And it didn't really enter into my education days, and it didn't really enter into my early working days. Coming out of grad school, or rather, I guess, in between years at MBA, I got a job in investment banking, probably for the right reason, which was I liked finance, but for the wrong reason because everyone else wanted it. I had no clue what was really going to be involved, but I liked it. And I ended up in New York with Goldman Sachs. And then I moved to London. I had 30 years in New York and London. And during that time, on a professional level, it was only in the latter years that this issue of environment, sustainability, more broad social issues started really coming to the fore. And I hadn't focused on it. In my private life, however, it was other influences. My wife, for example, was very involved in Nature Conservancy and chaired that for a while. And I found myself getting more involved on a personal level in issues in and around the environment, being able to use some of my experiences and my contacts. And so on retirement, I tried to think hard about how I could dedicate my time. And the notion of sustainable finance, i.e. the integration of financial issues together with environmental and other broader social and sustainability issues, felt like it was a really important topic where I might be able to make a difference. So my wife and I set up a foundation. We started getting very involved in things. And the more you get involved, the more you kind of get sucked in and you learn more and you start to feel like you've got a handle on certain things and that you can add based on your experience. And so a number of us pushed the government to have a task force that other countries had already done on sustainable finance. And after pushing them hard enough, they kind of said, okay, tag, you're it. And with 3 others, joined the expert panel on sustainable finance and spent a year researching and interviewing people on that topic. And that just got me further and further, deeper and deeper into these issues.
So you mentioned more about sustainable finance, and we'll get into that, but just focusing more on a personal note, I can attest to the fact that from a student's perspective, it's tough to really take the insight from someone speaking in sustainability if they themselves do not represent the same sort of focus. So tell us a little bit more about what sustainability means to you now today, February 6th, 2021, and what you are doing in a personal capacity to help our society transition to a low carbon economy.
Well, a lot of my, there's different levels to this. Under the broad umbrella of sustainable finance, which is one of the principal ways in which I'm trying to focus on this, and we can talk about that a little bit later. It's basically how do you integrate the notions of climate change and other aspects of sustainability into the kind of everyday reflexes in finance. And so I'm pushing hard on the policy side. I'm pushing hard on how do the actors in the financial sector, the banks and insurance companies and so on, how do they pursue their business and integrate these notions into how they go about their business. I'm very involved on the investing side to support clean tech innovation that are coming up with climate solutions and so on. But on a personal level, I spend a lot of time speaking at engagements like this. I'm helping, as you mentioned, at Queen's and at Ivy, trying to get institutes moving on these issues. And when I'm living my life, frankly, my wife is a very disciplined influence on, how we live our lives and things like what materials do we use in the house? What food do we eat? Do we travel or not travel? How do we travel? What energy sources do we use? And I didn't think about a lot of those things earlier in life, and now I think a lot about those things, and find that while it's very difficult to be perfect, you can make a lot of differences just by being thoughtful about things.
And you mentioned a little bit about policy. So in discussing sort of the burden versus the opportunity, in discussing issues like climate change and sustainability, which are obviously two very important and, if you will, saturated terms in today's society, would you consider them to be burdens or opportunities? And I think it's especially important for my generation to hear your take on this, because we are the ones who innately inherit these circumstances and feel a sense of responsibility.
Well, I'm sure that you all feel an enormous burden after, the mismanagement, frankly, of previous generations on some very important issues like the environment and equality and inclusion. And in some ways, I could see you staring at all of us and saying, geez, you left us a real mess to clean up. But at the same time, I think there have been a number of advances, not just in these issues, but much more broadly in society, that can facilitate some very positive moves from here. And there's an awful lot going on as well. It's easy to get focused on what's going to go wrong, the mess, and to feel a sense of helplessness even sometimes. How am I going to make a difference to an outcome that is so big and complicated here? And so at the same time, I genuinely look at it and I say, for all of you, this is going to be an unbelievable opportunity with regard to your careers. And your careers don't have to mean business careers or financial careers. In your careers, whatever it is, the degree of change that's going to take place is going to be tremendous, and it's already starting to happen. Al Gore, I mean, you can feel different ways about the way in which he's put certain things forward, but at the same time, he's someone who's very thoughtful, and he's put it forward sometimes saying, look, there was the Industrial Revolution, there was the Agrarian Revolution, there was the technology revolution earlier on, starting 70s, 80s, but accelerating ever since then. And this, some people are calling it the Great Reset. The notion being that after all of those big changes that had so many positive impacts, but had some very important negative impacts on the environment, on social equality, and so on, that the Great Reset allows us to go back and take the best from those previous massive revolutions in different ways and add to it, improve it, add to it, make it work in a way where sustainability is somewhat at the forefront. And this means careers, it means innovations, it means storytelling, it means a lot of different things. There was a partner of mine at Goldman Sachs, David Blood, who actually, he partnered with Al Gore. They, for a while, were thinking of calling their firm Blood and Gore, but they decided not to. But they've been very successful in investing, and I think he's one of the most successful investors of his time. And he's been very public in saying, for example, the transition to net zero emissions could be the most significant investment opportunity of our lifetimes, meaning all the careers associated with that and all the opportunities, be it science, be it business, be it investing, be it whatever, that go with that. One of the biggest opportunities. And I think the more that we all get focused on that, the faster things will act. Because unfortunately, I'm a little bit cynical. Humans act way too much in a personal interest. And if there is great personal interest at stake and personal opportunity, then you're more likely to achieve collective action in the right direction. So I think it's really critical to lessen the doom and the gloom and to ignite a sense of opportunity here And I think it is going to be tremendous for all of you if you are seeing it in that positive light and going and seeking that opportunity.
To lessen the doom and the gloom and to frame it as an opportunity. I love that. And in just discussing, you mentioned the mismanagement by previous generations and the burden that many students my age feel today. I think it's causing a sense of anxiety to some, but also, as you mentioned, a feeling of helplessness and how can I make a difference, a tangible difference myself. But like you said, one is not too few. It can go a long way. So for terms like sustainability and equality, those are obviously very broad terms. How best to think about them without feeling totally overwhelmed?
Yeah, they are very broad, and it's easy for it all to fall on its own weight because it is so broad. Where do you start? Where do you stop? What's the definition? What are you talking about? And for me, it's best to think of these things as North Stars, as guiding principles for how you live your life, how you run a company, how government sets its priorities. And you do need definition, and you do need to break these notions into digestible pieces in order to then, positively and constructively attack them and move them forward. But for me, sustainability, I go back to the Brundtland Report of the UN back in 1987. There was a report on development and consumption and so on. And what was said then was development that meets the needs, defining sustainability as development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their needs, with three different pillars, one being environmental protection, one being social equity, and another one being economic vitality. And it's important to keep that third one in mind, because if number one and number two, environment and social equity, are not matched with economic vitality, there's going to be a conflict and there's going to be resistance. I also think more in a localized Canadian way, there's this indigenous notion of the seventh generation principle that the Haudenosaunee people, this principle thought to have really come in somewhere in the years 1100 to 1500 or so. But the notion being that decisions that we make today should result in a sustainable world 7 generations into the future, when that relates to energy and water and resources and human relationships. But in order to pursue it, these big, broad notions, if we keep them as North Stars, as big overriding principles, but then break them down into granular, digestible pieces, piece by piece, under an overall framework, then we can make real progress. And those digestible pieces are going to be things that an individual's interested in. Is it water? Is it air? Is it climate change? Is it women's rights? Is it indigenous issues? There are so many different aspects of these things, and picking one or a couple to become really, really good at and strong at allows the totality to advance.
So we've talked a little bit from a personal purview and now from a general lens. Before we get your perspective, which I know a lot of people are looking forward to, why don't we just quickly dive into detail a little bit? From my reading and understanding of sustainable finance, it is defined as really the intersection of economics and sustainability, where financial ingenuity and expertise channel into both the opportunities and challenges, as you mentioned, posed by climate change. Could you describe in your words what this field really is and what its growth may look like over the next few years?
Yeah, I think you've pretty much got it. The basic premise is that finance is constantly adapting, and we need to modernize finance and adapt it to today's realities, and notably, not limited to, but notably to integrate the assessment of climate change into the normal financial decisions, lending, investing, insurance. And why do we need to do this? And it's, again, sort of a basic notion that what gets financed gets done. If you have a good idea that doesn't get financed, it's just a good idea. And so it's really important that these finances, the capital flows, move in a direction which is consistent with societal aims. And right now, some aspects of how our economic system works are that the commons quite often is for free. The air, the water, other things, depending on which jurisdiction, you can take advantage of that freedom, sometimes freedom to pollute, freedom, to destroy the land, freedom to do a number of different things. And what we need to do is we need to have the financial system integrating these risks and opportunities of issues like climate change into their decision making, so that naturally the money flows in the directions that we want. And if we get that right, then we have a dynamic system that can allow growth, that funds innovation, that builds efficient buildings, that builds infrastructure better so that it can adjust to these changes, that even values things like the protection of wetlands or other issues that you wouldn't normally associate with normal economic decision making. And so the big question is how we can accelerate that thinking and get the system moving. One of the big positives right now is this tremendous acceleration in corporates and governments building this notion of net zero 2050 and building plans around that. They are going to involve enormous amounts of financing that the government itself cannot afford. It's going to rely on the private sector for a lot of that money for transition. And so the financial system has to be operating in a consistent manner to these societal goals.
So you sort of just boldly declared that what gets financed gets done. And we have a couple of questions that have come in from our chat here discussing responsibility and whether it really falls on the shoulders of students or on high-level financial executives. So in that vein, as an experienced business executive of many years, how do you think about issues of sustainability? Are they front of mind? And would you say you are a fair representative of the majority or an outlier?
Well, it's changing. I think it's changing very fast. And for some folks, yeah, it's front of mind. But I would like to argue maybe not enough people. But I think it is shifting. There's an awful lot of people, and we're all guilty in our own lives in different ways. We're all guilty of the we should. We should means somebody else should, and maybe I'll follow along later. And think that things don't apply to ourselves. It applies to the collective. It applies to the other person. But I do think that the notion of, within business, values-led organizations are gaining enormous strength and gaining enormous support. For some, you have to realize, and this is where the individual voice and the voice around the dinner table can have a big impact. For some, they don't know why these issues are important and why it's at all in their interest to get focused on them. They don't know how it connects to their day-to-day or what the financial consequences of what they're doing. For some, they might understand it, but they don't really know what they can do about it. For some, it's just not how they got trained and they're following old patterns. And for some, it's a little more cynical and, well, why should I have to do this if nobody else is? And for a lot of people, though, they're starting to realize that business is there to serve society in some fashion. And societal expectations are changing. And business responds to three types of things. One is what they have to do, that's the rules and so on. One is what they want to do, i.e., build competitive advantage and make money and so on. And the third is what they feel they should do based on societal expectations and community expectations. And that's where everybody's voice, very loudly, will continue to have an impact on how business operates and thinks about their role in the broader societal context. And I think they're hearing some of those voices a lot more loudly. But literally, the number of executives that 2 years ago were saying, climate what? How does that relate? What are you talking about? That now are saying, geez, we really got to get focused on this, because I was talking to my daughter the other day and she keeps bugging me about, and that changes their mind. That gets them focused. And so for whatever motivation, self-interest, long-term sustainability of a business, or even just family pressure, things are changing, and they're changing fast. And now business is starting to understand what I was talking about before, about the scale of the opportunity if they can get these things right.
Yes, and just quickly to all of our attendees, obviously to err is human. As much as we can prepare to mitigate any obstacle, this makes the conference very human and fallible. So we apologize for that, but we're excited that we're able to get it up and running again. Andy, in segueing a little bit, what in your view are the most exciting initiatives that are taking place currently that relate to these issues?
Well, there's a lot, and they're growing all the time. But I'm going to be very counterintuitive initially and say, how about COVID? And you might go, what the heck is this guy talking about? But I think the reality is we have all just been given an enormous wake-up call. And we understand that we need to get focused on what's really important to us and to our ongoing survival as a society and so on. We've also seen in COVID that things like these issues, and it's not dissimilar to climate change, have unreasonably more significant impacts on less well-represented parts of society and lower socioeconomic parts of society. And that these issues of environmental and social and the governance of systems and so on, these issues are really important for us to get right, because if they go wrong a little bit, they go wrong a lot. And I think we're starting to realize that. And so instead of the focus coming off these issues because of COVID, they're coming on in a very dramatic way. But beyond that, the Paris Agreement and the follow through on the Paris Agreement, and that translating into net zero emission commitments, is a huge, huge series of initiatives. The fact that solar energy is now cheaper than traditional energy is a huge breakthrough, because it means that the technology worked and it's now more economically efficient as well as socially beneficial. The investors are changing radically, and companies are being forced to start to measure what their impact on the environment, on society more broadly is. And they never really had to report on what their impact was previously. And sunlight is a very good disinfectant when it comes to disclosure.
And then just before we wrap up in the next 3 or so minutes, 2 questions quickly. Not all people seem to care about these issues. And as a youth, as a member of the youth? How do I deal with that?
Well, a number of different ways. Part of it is learn a lot about it yourself so that you actually know what you're talking about. You've got the facts, you understand what the issues are, because there's always a lot of hearsay and opinion and so on. And having the facts, really understanding something is really important. Second is be a role model. Nobody's perfect, but try not to be too contradictory. Don't, pontificate about climate change and then buy all the stuff that is promoting emissions, and think about your consumption levels and how you can help. Also, people don't like being told that they're wrong or bad, and they don't like being told what to do. And so, and I'm guilty of it all the time. My kids know that. How do you avoid preaching? And how do you get on to the positivity? If we can change this way, here are the great opportunities. So kind of being an educator without preaching, but also being a storyteller around this so that it makes sense to people rather than preaching. And then understanding where other people are coming from, because not everybody stands in your shoes. You've got to stand in their shoes, and there's different issues. And finally, I guess the thing that bugs me the most is this notion of polarization that's occurring that creates stalemate. You're an idiot. No, you're an idiot. You don't understand. No, you don't understand. And I think breaking down that polarization and understanding what motivates the other person and creating the story that is going to appeal to their understanding and collectively figuring out how we shift is a good way to go about things.
Amazing. And Andy, any final words just quickly as we wrap up in a minute, as you sit virtually before an audience of 1,000 global change makers who are poised to have a positive impact in the world, and many of whom are deeply impassioned by the issues of sustainability that we've talked about?
Well, two things. One is this notion of sustainability used to be this tiny corner when I was in, my education years. It was this tiny, mostly environmental corner, and it was way over on the side. Now it is everything. It is science, new materials, bioecosystems, new chemistry that is driving innovation. It's finance, it's investing, it's banking, it's food and farming, it's buildings, it's cars, EVs, and so on. It's building things. It's the storytelling in arts and journalism. It's law is changing. The medical community, obviously, we're experiencing that. The inventor and entrepreneur. So everything that you can think about doing has got a notion of sustainability. It's not over there in the corner. It's central to all these things. And it's a matter of finding how to attach yourself within those frameworks that we know, law or finance or arts or whatever. How do you attach the notion of sustainability into what you're doing? And then the last thing I'd say, which someone told me early in my career, it's a little bit trite, but they said, there's three types of people. People who make things happen, people who watch things happen, and people who wonder what the heck just happened. Who do you want to be?
We want to make things happen. And as we wrap up, Andy, I just want to say a big thank you for joining us today. Your personal insights, your remarks, your anecdotes, I can't tell you with exact certainty how much they mean today, but I can promise you that they might just make the difference moving forward. To all of you joining us, all of our attendees, thank you for listening and sending forward your questions. During this transition time, please move on to your first plenary session, which will start promptly at 9:50. You can find those links on your personalized schedule, which can be accessed through our website, worldaffairs.ucc.on.ca. For those of you who have not yet made your plenary choices, please do so as soon as possible by again accessing our schedule tab on the website. And finally, before we end, just remember what Andy talked about, the Great Reset. Sustainability is a massive opportunity for all of us. So let's make sure out of those three types of people, we are the ones to make things happen.
Thank you again, Andy, and thank you everyone for listening. Please enjoy your first plenary session.
Bye all.